I thought I'd begin with some key points to set the scene for this presentation. It's important to know that men are most often the perpetrators of all forms of violence, and men are also more likely to experience violence throughout their life. Men from refugee background are more likely to have directly experienced torture, and women are more likely to have experienced rape and sexual assault as weapons of war. There's a higher rate of psychopathology amongst tortured male refugees when compared with non-tortured male refugees. Intimate partner violence, which I'll sometimes refer to as IPV, is perpetrated by an intimate partner, usually male, and it includes physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, and stalking. IPV is a highly potent risk factor for mental illness, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. I led a large-scale study of mental disorder and gender-based violence in Australia. It's published in JAMA, which showed strong associations with common mental disorder, PTSD, attempted suicide, amongst women. So this graph shows the influencing factors in IPV perpetration by men against women, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the key determining factors: distinct gender roles and hierarchy, male entitlement to abused women, low social power and value of women, and ideas of manhood or masculinity that are linked to the control of women, and using violence as a norm to deal with conflict or anger. And I'll also draw your attention to the point that relates to having witnessed or experienced violence in the past. This is kind of a segue to my next slide. What about torture and its association with IPV? Although differing in key aspects, torture and IPV share some core characteristics, including the intention of the perpetrator to subjugate, degrade, or disempower the victim. They're the same, similar. Consequently, survivors are often left with persisting feelings of humiliation, self-doubt, and emotional isolation, reactions that are interrelated with society's tendency to condone, conceal, or minimise these violations. Together, these factors may undermine the capacity of survivors to manage frustrations, and where there are also factors of male power and entitlement to use violence, it can lead to use of aggression in the family, particularly against women. Before there was research, clinicians working with refugees and other conflict-affected populations noticed that IPV may be, or noted that IPV may be higher in families of torture survivors. But what about the empirical evidence? What happened? Okay, got it. But what about the empirical evidence linking torture and IPV? Our data, which we published in Global Mental Health in 2017, provided systematic evidence of an association between torture and IPV, as well as the direct pathway from torture to IPV via mental disturbance, which we measured using the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire and the K10. The study confirmed that low socioeconomic status, particularly related to being a torture survivor, adds to the risk. The high prevalence of IPV, though, in the broader context, suggested that there are other structural factors at play, perhaps persisting patriarchal attitudes that contribute to the risk. So a study actually definitely underscored why early detection and good intervention may assist in reducing the risk of IPV in families where men have been tortured. If you read our article, you'll find that it has references to other studies that have shown connections between general war exposure and IPV, and I particularly note the work of Catani, my colleague Catani and others. So torture remains a ubiquitous instrument of repression despite the ratification of the United Nations Convention on Torture. And it's important to state that the so-called war on terror dispelled the notion that torture was a practice confined to countries ruled by oppressive regimes or in states of major conflict. There's now conclusive evidence that trauma has a major impact on mental health and psychosocial functioning of survivors. Zachary Steele's systematic meta-regression and systematic review amongst refugees and other populations exposed to persecution confirmed that torture is the most potent of all the traumas of mass conflict in generating post-traumatic stress disorder. And in addition, PTSD in torture survivors, as you probably know, is more severe and chronic and is frequently complicated by symptoms of anxiety, depression and substance misuse. And for all these reasons, there's a higher risk that survivors will develop major interpersonal difficulties when they come into the country of settlement and, of course, within the families. So, but what's the theory? Male survivors of torture may indeed be at risk of enacting violence within the family, particularly against their intimate partners, for several interrelated reasons. As mentioned in the previous slide, PTSD and symptoms of anxiety and depression tend to be more common, severe and chronic amongst torture survivors. Associated excessive use of alcohol and other substances further reduces frustration tolerance and thereby may increase the risk of anger and aggression toward intimate partners. More broadly, torture represents an assault on the person's sense of dignity, integrity and dignity, undermining the survivor's self-esteem. In the case of soldiers, militants or political activists, a strongly developed masculine warrior identity we see. So male survivors of torture may overcompensate for their sense of loss of control by reasserting their male power within the family, which in the extreme situation may increase the risk of IPV. A key problem appears to be found at the intersection of masculinity, repressed ability to express feelings and empathise, feelings of anger, and pervasive gendered norms that condone violence against women. David Lesser wrote that masculinity has been shaped by war and poignantly speaks about soldiers who killed and faced the threat of death and then returned home to households that were enveloped by the muteness of male anguish, and then often sought refuge in alcohol and violence in the family. While some may refer to our biological and predisposition to male and female behaviours, the world has for centuries militarised men and commodified women. Whilst there are multiple reactions and contexts related to torture in conflict-affected males, the most toxic is the one where the male, emasculated by the experience of torture, returns to a home which is governed by gendered norms that entitle him to express his anger and to dominate his female partner. In the recently arrived refugee male context, he has commonly not yet connected his anger and aggression with former experiences of conflict, loss and trauma, and he may justify his use of violence and be in denial about the harm to his partner and children. These are the challenges that confront the practitioner. As students and practitioners, we learn about the importance of empathy. And when working with perpetrators of horrendous crimes of intimate partner violence against women, our capacity for empathy can be challenged. Working with survivors of torture who are also perpetrators of violence can make us feel highly conflicted. The question is, how can we prepare ourselves for these contingencies of human life, often more pronounced in the trauma field? There are often conflicting issues related to tragedy, compassion, grief, loss of dignity, and humiliation beyond the control of the individual, and our human capacity and willingness to share all of these, particularly with those who have gone on to hurt others. This is the right slide. I've been working on an intervention with men from refugee background who are also perpetrators of IPV. We're working with the organisation Say No to Violence and also the Australian Centre for Health and Human Rights. To date, actually, there's very little evidence that anything works to address IPV with men from mainly non-English speaking background. Our intervention involves the therapist or counsellor empathising, and also mindfulness techniques to sensitise men who have experienced conflict and torture at an emotional level to the harm that they do to women and children in their family. This occurs with a social and structural emphasis on understanding both war and patriarchy, which I'll revisit a little later. In challenging men's behaviour, we also underscore the value of being good role models for children. They must, however, understand how violence against their partner constitutes abuse toward children. Engagement with the male parenting role can assist men to focus on their actions and the consequences of their behaviour on the family. Being a good parent can help regain a meaningful and positive role, a factor that can contribute to recovery from trauma related to loss of masculine identity. A challenge in this space, however, is that some violent men claim to be good fathers as part of their self-identity, while their construction of love and care for their children is often based around their own needs and not their children's. Be mindful that children, like women, can be wrongfully perceived as the man's possession or his investment. Although I don't have time to focus on mindfulness in therapy and behaviour change, I thought I'd just mention one primary conceptual difference between CBT and mindfulness. Mindfulness comes from the Eastern tradition, particularly Buddhism, and mindfulness makes, or seems to make, sense when working with torture survivors who are also violent toward intimate partners, because it requires both self-acceptance and deep experience of the present moment, including the impact of behaviour on others, consideration of. It allows a calm abiding including the impact with current experiences, whereas CBT includes the evaluation of thoughts or goals to change behaviours and to consider them, maladaptive or irrational. Mindfulness focuses more on developing an understanding that is within and beyond the self. A primary aim is to engender an empathic reaction in the conflict and trauma-exposed male, the warrior. We hypothesise that empathy is a foundation for working with men to challenge and change violent behaviour. I was musing on how the Greek tragedy commonly evoked images of the warrior man becoming empathic when reflecting on their personal capacity for harm and the effects of violence on those they love. In other words, the warrior survivor of torture, the masculine hero, can understand at an emotional level the suffering he can go on to perpetrate. In Homer's Iliad, Priam, king of Troy, visits the Greek warrior Achilles and begs him to return his son Hector's body for a proper funeral. Achilles had killed Hector in a fury because Hector had killed Achilles' best friend. In violation of the mores of men and gods, Achilles dragged Hector's corpse around the walls of Troy for 11 days in grief and vengeance. In his appeal to Achilles, Priam invokes his profound grief for his son and his old age. He reminds Achilles of his father's old age as well. This sensitising of each other at an emotional level to the harm they have done in the context of those they love causes the two warriors to touch and weep together. Priam over his son Hector and Achilles over his ageing father and the loss of his friend. And similarly, some Maori warriors were known to routinely weep after battle. They used to wash the blood off themselves and then weep so that they could be released from the warrior mode. After that, they could return to feeling safe and to trust each other again. Empowerment is in some ways the opposite side of the coin to the psychology of understanding emotions, but it's important that both occur. Empowerment rather concerns depathologizing the torture survivor by sharing with him an understanding of the structural forces that were involved with his being and becoming a victim of torture. Key is understanding that becoming a torture victim was not a result of an individual personal weakness, but rather something that happened to many men and for reasons that were most often beyond their control. Similarly, the perpetrator needs to understand the structural factors related to culture and society, patriarchy and power, that support, condone, or enable him to use violence against women. He needs to see his violence as harmful and as a crime. Empowerment therapy essentially focuses on structural rather than individual issues. Empowerment, of course, is also very effective in working with survivors of IPV. Once she turns a socially motivated inclination to internalise blame for her exposure to IPV toward understanding issues of male power and gender inequality, she is fortified and strengthened to address its psychological effects. The counsellor or therapist may identify some core beliefs that are commonly articulated by the perpetrator of IPV, who is also a torture survivor settling in Australia. These will need to be reconstructed with him. The first is he may take a victim stance. The torture survivor needs to understand that he is responsible for violence, his violence against his female partner, and its harm regardless of the torture experience. The second is male entitlement. The male, particularly from refugee background, needs to know that he has no entitlement in Australia to harm his wife or partner, and that she is or should be his equal under the law here. Sometimes a fear of authorities that we see in refugees can be used for positive outcome when it's applied sensitively. The third is patriarchal beliefs and righteous anger. Anger is felt by torture survivors, but anger should not be justified or inappropriately directed at intimate partners. Practitioners should facilitate empowerment-inspired understanding of the social and political factors, as I said, that lead to torture and conflict-related violence. This redirects feelings of anger to the appropriate place. Revisit empathy and the impact of violence and fear to maintain power and control over the intimate partner. He cannot continue to punish her for his feelings of emasculation or anger. To reiterate, men who use violence choose to respond to their feelings of anger, jealousy, or shame through the use of violence, often blaming their partner for making him feel those things. So now some just final points. We've discussed or learnt to sensitise the torture survivor, who is also a perpetrator of IPV at an emotional level, to the harm he's doing to his partner and children. We've acknowledged and reflected on our own conflicted feelings about working with the torture survivor, who is also using his power to harm his partner and children. We've used and considered the importance of engendering empathy and mindfulness, and we've considered the value of building an understanding of the etiology of war and torture and the situational and sometimes chaotic context of the torture to perpetrators' life experiences. If we do that in practice, we will have hopefully started to shift the emotionally deleterious effects of shame, humiliation, and loss of power. We've learned to explore factors that may be associated with his frustration, anger, and the need to regain control. He should understand, importantly, how this happens relatively easily in a context where he has some perceived cultural or social entitlement to abuse his power and abuse his partner. And finally, we need to make some kind of a contract with men who use violence against women. IPV is mentally and physically harmful to women, and it's a crime. When working with perpetrators, we need to insist on the cessation of IPV, and we need to do everything that we can to monitor the family to ensure the safety of women and children. And even though I've said that last, that's actually the primary first thing that must happen. So the last thing, I kind of like this, and I thought it had some resonance with tonight. It's a quote by the 19th century American poet Henry Longfellow, who said, "Every man has his secret sorrows which the world knows not. Oftentimes we call a man cold when he is only sad." Thank you.